Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is all about serious thinking for a serious church. We thought it was time to stop playing in the intellectual kiddie pool and to finally dive into the deep end. So all of our content is designed to push toward that end as Christian intellectuals and no longer just jellyfish. Now, I'm Jordan Stefaniak, president of the London Lyceum, and I'm always thrilled to have you guys here with me, watching the videos or listening in podcast format. So shout out to all of you who are exclusive subscribers who get access to this in podcast form. I really appreciate you guys supporting us and hoping to spread and encourage more serious thinking that has all the sort of intellectual virtues we seek to promote and pursue. Now, before I get started, as a reminder, go ahead and like the video. Even if you don't like it just because you're my friend, you like it, that helps to spread the videos around so that people can get better access to better quality material and content. You'd be surprised and amazed at how much YouTube is just an incredible tool to spread all sorts of good content if you have good content, but YouTube is full of bad content. So like the video to help spread better stuff. At least hopefully you think this is better stuff. Also, subscribe to the video. Even if you're listening on podcasts, go to YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel. This helps us out to spread more content again. And I know from the trusty YouTube stats that 20% of you guys who watch my stuff on YouTube are not subscribed. So yes, I'm calling you out. Subscribe for me. Just hit the button. That's awesome. Thank you. And comment. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Always love to hear from you guys, whether you agree or disagree. Seems like 50-50. I get comments that disagree, and other 50% I actually get stuff that's encouraging. Now, not that disagreeing is discouraging. It's not. It helps me to think. Anyway, let's jump in to the topic at hand. I plan to talk a little bit about perfect being theology, particularly questions like, does perfect being theology make God a Superman? No. That's my answer. No. So thanks for tuning in to the show, Kiffin's Keep. This has been a lot of fun. Go ahead and comment below. No, I'm obviously kidding. That would be a fun way to end it. A little bit cheeky and also right on target. But I've seen stuff on the Twitter sphere making rounds again about perfect being theology that I think is a little bit silly. So I wanted to go ahead, define it, and do a little bit of defense. I may not get all the defense in place, but hey, I'll do my best. And by the way, if you're watching on YouTube, you like the classic hat, drop a comment below if you like the old school Jags. And if you're listening on podcast, well, sorry you don't get to see my pretty hat. That's very old. I think I got this probably in like first grade or something, and here I am rocking it. So, perfect being theology. What is it? Well, it's just the general idea that you are going to ascribe all of the greatest possible things to God in the greatest possible way. So this, if you're familiar with medieval theology and others, it's sort of like the via triplex, the way of eminence aspect of the via triplex, where you're going to ascribe all the best things to God in the best possible way, in its proper proportion, and you're going to take out all of the imperfections that would be associated with it. So if you want to think of the sort of paragon example in the medieval era, that's going to probably be Anselm. He's the most famous because he popularizes sort of the phrasing that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived or can be thought. There's nothing beyond him. So whatever you're thinking, think it to the greatest possible, maximum possible level, and that's where God is. So for example, you're going to start with a concept, say wisdom. You're going to pull out all of the imperfections. You might think of the wisest person you know. Maybe it's your grandfather. Maybe it's a mentor. Maybe it's somebody else, and you think, oh, that person's really wise. They're wise because of all these reasons, but they're not always wise. Maybe they're sometimes unreliable. Maybe they're not wise about everything. So you're going to pull out all these imperfections. And then you're going to ascribe them to the greatest possible degree. So it's a wisdom that never ends. It's exhaustive. It knows all possible options and executes wisely in all situations. And you ascribe that to God. That's the basic idea of perfect being theology. It's not nefarious. It's not scary. It's not bad at all. It's rather just going along the grain of Scripture itself. You look at Scripture, you find it all over, where God is perfect love, His work is perfect, His law is perfect, His gifts are perfect, His way is perfect, He's perfect in knowledge, no one's greater than Him, no one can be compared to Him. God's the most perfect being that could possibly be conceived. And you find this even in the church fathers, where they have these sort of concepts that they use as almost filters to think about God. So when we're thinking about a concept, it must be fitting to God and it must be worthy of God. So it's protecting His worthiness for worship of who God is. This is not just a pagan notion that they're borrowing from those around them, saying, well, the gods must be really strong or something like crude like that. It's just a standard approach to thinking about this is the way Scripture speaks of God, and I'm going to use that as really an interpretive grid to think about some of the more underdetermined areas of Scripture, or the more metaphorical areas of Scripture. So, for example, God is my rock. You can pull out the perfections from that and ascribe them to God. He's reliable, He's steadfast, He's trustworthy. These sort of ideas you're pulling out from it, but you're removing the imperfections as you do it. It's not worthy to think of God as a rock that's completely immobile, that doesn't act on my behalf, that just sits there, has rough edges. No. There's the particular idea that's behind there. And perfect being theology can help draw that out. So that's all that's really going on here. It's nothing worrisome. It's not just a tool of the philosophers. But let's go ahead and get into some of the objections, because I think that's where the fun really lies, and you'll be able to see some of the distinctiveness of what perfect being theology is, how it works, how it isn't what the objections might paint it as. So one of them, and you can find 4 of these 6 objections that I'm going to cover in an old article that I wrote for Journal of Reformed Theology. I will link to that in the description or the show notes if you're listening on the podcast format, so you can click it and read it if you would like. Last I checked, it was open access, but as of this recording, I don't know if it is. I think it is. Hopefully it is. I should have checked before I started talking, but here I am. So click it, see if it is. If it's not, email me, contact@thelondonlyceum.com. We'll see what we can do. Now, number 1, a possible objection is intuitions just in general shouldn't guide us. So the idea here is supposed to be that perfect being theology is sort of like a seemings theology. God seems better this way than that way. It seems that He would be more perfect if He did this rather than this. It seems, you can find this, everybody's doing perfect being theology. So let's just be clear, everybody's doing it. You're just working with different concepts of perfection. So you might look at Thomas Ord, and he would say it'd be more perfect that God would be hurt and pained, and that He would not be all powerful so that He can get him off the hook for evil. So He's not evil, so that way He is perfect in that sense, but He doesn't really know the future, yada, 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 yada. There's a worry here, I think, that just we shouldn't let these intuitions guide us. But I just don't find that plausible in any sense. Like I mentioned, the idea that God is my rock. Are we just supposed to just assume that that's all there is to it and we can't say anything further? That we can't extrapolate and pull out the perfections that are supposed to be in that statement? Of course not. I think that's just crazy. So I'm going to move on because I don't feel like spending a bunch of time talking about what I think is a crazy objection. And I don't remember who said this one, but maybe it's one that's just common, latent in people's imaginations when they think of perfect being theology. A second one does have a name affixed to it. This is the idea that perfect being theology is sort of an abstract bending apart from the narrative of Scripture, where it's overly speculative, and it's not attuning itself to the shape of the gospel, let's say. John Webster has a critique along these lines, and I think he's really leaning on sort of, if he's not directly leaning on him, he's leaning on him in a sort of indirect sense, and that would be Karl Barth with his just constant insistence that all things natural theology are bad, perfect being theology, natural theology is not attentive to Christology and Scripture, whatever. I think this critique is wrong-headed, and I love John Webster, but I think he got this one wrong. And because perfect being theology need not ignore the narrative arc of Scripture, maybe it does for some people, but Maybe you're worried that Anselm's project in particular, where he goes and he tries to build an argument for who God is apart from Scripture. He intentionally does that for his own particular purposes, which I think is fine. But maybe you're worried about that sort of project. Well, not all perfect being theology has to be like that. Perfect being theology can very well be consistent and conversant with the narrative of Scripture, allowing it to inform it, allowing it to shape its idea of perfection, reshape its ideas and its rejections. There's no reason not it can't. There's nothing intrinsic to perfect being theology that makes it abstract and bending of Scripture in ways that are not proper to it. So I don't think that's a good objection. Another objection, this is very common, this is the Superman objection, where perfect being theology has this quantitative view of divine transcendence, where it's almost like you just have this one line, God's at the top, we're at the bottom, or something's at the bottom, we're somewhere in the middle maybe, and you just look at all the perfections that I have, that my friends have, that, look, he's wise, look, he's good, look, he's great, look, he's strong, and then we just say, well, God is like that, but he's just infinitely strong. And there's no sort of like metaphysical difference. There's no break between the two where there's a different ontological level. God's just another piece, metaphysical, ontological piece of this universe. And he's just infinitely whatever it is that I have, to the infinite degree. But there's nothing that's like really distinct, categorically distinct about God. So Michael Allen does this. Scott Oliphant does this. Well, Scott Oliphant just calls it, Superman theology, basically, where perfect being theology ends up with a generic Superman, where he's got all these great powers, but that's about it. He's not triune. I don't find that persuasive. Perfect being theology doesn't have to do that. Maybe it does for some people. I don't know. I don't think it does. There's no reason it can't be a qualitative distinction, and include divine transcendence. I just don't see why it can't do that, why it can't accommodate that. Another common objection is that it's pragmatically useless because it's too vague. There's nothing perfect being theology can do on its own, really. It doesn't really tell us much of anything. Well, I think that's wrong. Jeff Speaks has a whole book dedicated to this. But I also think it's foolish, because why can't I use perfect being theology in conjunction with other tools? It's not the only tool in my toolkit. I can use all sorts of other aspects or interpretive means and processes alongside divine revelation in Scripture to guide how I should think about what it means to be perfect. Divine simplicity. That's not anywhere in Scripture. It doesn't say God is not composed of parts. But I can use perfect being theology to sift, to remove the imperfections, to highlight the perfections, to say, well, we don't want to say that God is dependent upon anything because that would be an imperfection, but we want to say that God is completely and wholly independent of all things. That's just perfect being theology at work. Understanding, contemplating, thinking through the aspects of what Scripture says about God and beginning to sort of theologize and in a coherent way. There's another objection. Bruce Ware makes this objection where this is a tool of the philosophers and not the theologians. Number one, I think that's false. I think you find this practice all throughout the tradition. It's not just Anselm. It's not just Thomas. You find this in Basil the Great. You find this in Petrus van Matras, however you say his name. Butchered it. A butcher of names. You find this in John Owen. You find this in Herman Bavinck. I mean, it's everywhere. You see Owen and Maastricht, they're going... arguing against the Socinians, and I think Turretin does something similar, where they're basically just saying the Socinian concept of God impoverishes his perfection. If you want to have a perfect God, you must have X, Y, Z ascribed to the greatest degree. Socinians don't do that, therefore they're wrong. That's perfect being theology, as a theologian would do it. But even if Bruce were right, even if this was a tool of the philosophers and not the theologians, there's nothing intrinsically defeating about that. It's not fatal. So what? I mean, I don't think it is. That may be worrisome. That may be suspicious. I think it would certainly be suspicious. But it's not fatal in any sense. So I just don't think that's a good objection. Another objection, this is the most recent one that I saw on the old trusty bird site of twitter.com. And it went like this. Let me find it. So the idea is that concept development on perfect being theology is deficient. Why? Because it's being done apart from divine revelation. I think that's a silly characterization of perfect being theology and objection to it. I don't know anyone who is thinking that way. He mentions Anselm in this, and he says he doesn't know if Anselm was at fault for this. Okay, bracket that. I think that's a little bit nutty, but just list anybody who's doing this. I don't think you can, and if you can, they're probably some unorthodox non-Christian. There's no one who's doing perfect being theology apart from divine revelation. Even Anselm, when he goes and he says, I'm going to set aside scripture and try to reason as much as I can and see where I can get, he's not doing it ignorant of divine revelation. Divine revelation has informed his theological imagination. It's informed his whole practice. So yes, divine revelation is still influencing his own rational capacities as he develops these ideas. So I think this is just a really unfortunate criticism of perfect being theology, and it seems to me that the ghost of Karl Barth creeps his way in here in a lot of these negative views of perfect being theology. I think perfect being theology is a fine approach to Scripture. It's a useful approach to thinking about the nature of God. It's protecting him, making sure all of the things that we say of God are worthy of God. It's protecting the God of the gospel so that we can confess God as God. There's nothing wrong with that. And everybody fundamentally agrees with the idea that God is perfect, and he's the most perfect being that there ever was, and ever will be. So it's just, I think the objections ultimately fall flat on perfect being theology. I think it's a great tool. We should use it. We shouldn't be afraid of it. It's actually a tremendous tool to protect our worship of who God is. Now, there's all sorts of ways it could go wrong, but that doesn't mean perfect being theology as a theological ethos or method or way of thinking, way of reasoning, as Cyril of Alexandria might say, is fundamentally faulty. It's a great way to do it, and I think that's how Scripture itself sort of like sets our minds and gives us sort of these tools of reasoning to think through it. So yeah, that's my thoughts on perfect being theology. You know, I've got other episode ideas in the queue that I hope to get to. So you guys who are loyal listeners, you've chatted, or you haven't chatted, you've commented in the past a couple of ideas that I've added to the queue, and I'm going to get to all of them that have been given to me so far. So at some point, I'm sure somebody's going to chat in or comment in, hey, do an episode on X, and I'm going to have to say, look, I can't do that. I'm totally incompetent on this. But so far, you've said stuff that I feel like I can actually add something useful to the conversation, because the idea behind these episodes is to actually provide useful commentary and not just ignorant ramblings of a fool that doesn't know what he's talking about, which would be the case in a lot of scenarios. But the ones you've said so far, I feel good about. I just need to prepare some. So they'll be out at some point in the future. Just stay tuned. Keep watching. I do have a spicy one that I plan to probably drop next week. I'm trying to make sure that these episodes are fundamentally positive in posture as much as possible. If there are negative sort of ones where I'm critiquing or I'm thinking through something, I want to make sure that those are spread out as much as possible to keep sort of the flavor of these the appropriate way. I think it's D.A. Carson once said in a book on exegetical fallacies that sustained negativity is highly calorific nourishment for pride. And I think he's absolutely right. It's very dangerous to major and focus on the negative alone. And so I hope to and seek to, in most of these episodes, think positively about topics, do model building and constructive work. That's a lot harder to do. It's very easy to set up YouTube shows or whatever else and just look at pastor, person, theologian, philosopher, and just point out all the issues. That's low tier content and material. The stuff that takes time, that's much harder, that's much more useful in the long term, is the sort of stuff that I'm hoping and trying to do, which is positive work to think through, like what are topics, what do they mean, fend off some objections to stuff that I think is accurate. Yeah, so that's that. Thanks, guys, for watching. This is a lot of fun for me. It's a lot of work for me, but it's also a lot of fun. I've got some ideas that I plan to throw out at you, and hopefully they'll be useful. Do some more Baptist stuff because I know you guys like the Baptist stuff. Do some more philosophical theology because I know you guys like that. I appreciate you all for supporting me. And as a reminder, I can't remember if I said this. So I've had some issues with my camera for recording, so I've had to do a couple of these multiple times. I recorded one last week on intellectual humility, and it was like at 2 a.m. I was recording it, and for some reason the stuff kept skipping, and it looked bad, and I was like, I can't post this, which was really annoying, so I'll probably record that again at some point in the future. I recorded this one just before this, had issues with it, and so I can't remember what I've said and what I haven't said, but I wanted to give a shout out to all of you who are listening on podcast, who are exclusive subscribers. So if you didn't know, you can support us in our effort to support and encourage more serious thinking by becoming an exclusive subscriber. So basically what this is, if you go to our podcast website, or you can go to londonlyceum.com or just our podcast in general, you can find it there where you can subscribe to the exclusive content for $5 a month or $50 a year. And you'll get access to all of Kiffin's Keep, all of Generally Particular, all of the Hanover House, plus other benefits. We have other shows that are coming and other material that we'd like to give you. So you're going to support us with $5 a month so that all of us together can band together and build out an institution that is serious about thinking for a serious church. And we're doing it in a distinctively Baptist flair. So I don't think you find really anyone else in the Baptist area who's doing thinking of this quality. So support us in that. Even if you don't listen in podcasts, jump on there and you can support us that way. You can donate other ways as well. But we really appreciate your support because we couldn't do it without you. We thank you for tuning in, and thanks for thinking with me.